Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Noah Rothman is senior political writer with National Review. Hello, Noah. Thank you for joining me today. It's a big day. I just spent, before the show, 45 minutes interviewing Haviv Rettig-Gur of the Times of Israel. I'm playing that out. But the reason it's a big day is that Bibi is at the White House with Trump. And I am reminded that when Churchill would show up at the White House with FDR, everything stopped because FDR could rarely leave the United States without, a whole bunch of stuff. What do you think they're talking about, and what is your most optimistic assessment of what could come out of these meetings, and what's your worst assessment of what could come out of these meetings?
Oh boy, what is my most optimistic assessment? I would hope that we would see agreements for the renewed transmission of ordnance to the IDF, the lifting of things like blocks on bulldozers, which the Biden administration imposed, which are used to clear IEDs from combat zones, a variety of the diplomatic, at least promises or spoken promises to get Israel's back in diplomatic institutions, which the Biden administration withdrew. We're hearing out of the press conference, from what I'm gathering, that the president is still stuck on this notion that you can functionally withdraw every Palestinian from the Gaza Strip, and that somehow solves the problem. I don't know who got that into his head, but it seems to me like a policy cul-de-sac that he's committed to. If that's the worst case scenario, I suppose it's a manageable one, but it does seem to be like there's a good and a bad side here, and we have to take them both simultaneously. But he does seem to be fixated on that, and I'm not sure that that's going to get anywhere. It certainly
I want to interject. I talked about that with Haviv. Donald Trump is fundamentally a developer, and he looks at Gaza. He told me on this show last month, it's the most beautiful real estate in the world, and Haviv said, yeah, it's actually the best beaches on the Mediterranean, but you can't fix them. So a developer's looking at that and thinking it's a construction site. It's not going to happen because Egypt and Jordan aren't going to take 2 million Gazans for 2 years. But he's thinking like a developer. I don't think it's that complicated.
Yeah, but he's not a developer. He's the president of the United States. And he needs to have some comprehension of how geopolitics works and how natural geography isn't necessarily the only consideration that you have to think of. You have to think of history. You have to think of ethnic and demographic makeups. You could say the same thing about the Horn of Africa. No one's going to be developing the Horn of Africa anytime soon. It's got lovely beaches, but it also has an indigenous culture that has incubated a piracy problem. It's not the sort of thing you can simply extirpate from the landscape as much as you'd like to. And the Israeli history with occupying Gaza should inform some of this thought process. I'm sure Haviv has additional thoughts on that, but I can't imagine that the Israeli
He was glad to hear him say it.
Believes that this is possible, much less anticipates.
He was glad to hear him say, the president doesn't get why that's not going to happen, but he was glad to see the pen on the desk. This is Israel, and the desk is the Middle East. He was glad as an Israeli to see the president speak that way. He calls him, quote, simple, not ignorant, not stupid, just black and white. Why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And it's developer talk now. I love developers. I worked for them for 25 years, but they do tend to think linearly about how to get their project done.
Yeah, and how to, grease the skids, as it were. One of the theories that I find rather persuasive is Donald Trump's approach to politics is informed by his history as developer in New York City, in which nothing happened unless the right person was greased.
Oh, stop. You've been listening to the commentary.
And that level of
You've been listening to the I always want to reach through the microphone and say, he develops in California, Scotland. He develops all over the countries, in Virginia, he's in Florida. He's not just the Manhattan developers. Developers develop all over the world. That is an erroneous concept and construct, Noah. Developers have to deal with planners, regional governments, state governments, federal regulations, wherever they work. And if they go to Scotland and abroad, they got to deal with national government. It's not that simple.
Okay. Well, then, fine. You're taking your argument to John. Regardless, I like the idea that the president thinks in terms of a developer. It is in conflict with how you should think about statecraft, because the government is not a business.
True.
Fundamentally something that we always encounter when we say, okay, you can restructure the government to operate as though it were a profit-based model, when it's not and lacks the profit motive, which is the sort of thing where you would approach Gaza, and you would say, okay, this would be a lovely beachside resort, without comprehending what Cairo's interests are, as you say, what Amman's interests are, Jerusalem, to say nothing of that in Saudi Arabia, and the culture in the Gaza Strip. This is going to be resolved not through land deals. This is going to be resolved on the battlefield first, and then through a negotiated settlement with the invested parties in the region: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, the Israelis, and perhaps Hamas and the Iranian proxies to a limited extent, certainly Qatar. But it's not going to be resolved by a development corporation. It's not going to be resolved by a local government that you could appeal to law. This is part of the fundamental problem with international people who think of in international environment in terms that would apply to a state. The international environment is anarchic. There is no constabulary to appeal to. There is no courtroom to appeal to. The power of hard power, the application of military force, or the threat of it held in reserve, which we call deterrence, is what moves the gears of history. It's what moves people, moves armies, and shapes events on the ground. And when you say, oh, well, we could just appeal to a local, like it's a local planning board situation or a local government or something that is governed by law, and the monopoly of force that is the backstop of that law, you fundamentally misapprehend.
I agree with that. No, I do think we ought not to dismiss how law can influence culture, but the fundamental problem, and I trust Aviv on this, is that Palestinian culture, at least among its elites, is caught in a deadly mythology, one that Khamenei shares for his own Shia purposes, but their fundamental culture is we can drive the Israelis out in the Algerian model, and they can't get off. Yep. That's not susceptible to developing your way out of.
No, it's not. But we've dealt with cultures that had this sort of suicidal honor code previously. And it was, in my view, it was mostly commerce that reshaped and reconfigured that sort of tribal and cultural ethic and made it comport more with what liberal democratic norms look like. And it's no coincidence that a lot of these societies that are hostile and that incubate this kind of idea are aggressive towards or skeptical towards international commerce. They think that it deludes their national ethos, and they're right about that. It does. It flattens it. But it also creates the conditions for international cooperation and the prosperity that results from it. And by the way, the peace and international cooperation that buttresses the U.S.-led geopolitical order. We should want that for much of the world and as many places of the world as we can possibly interject it into, because it provides for a better social covenant in those societies and therefore a more stable geopolitical environment around them. That's the sort of thing that you can envision for Gaza in the absence of Hamas, in the absence of Iran and the theocratic regime that controls it. Not without it, though. You know, the answer to the situation in Gaza is fundamentally going to be decided in what happens with the regime in Tehran.
Yes. No, I'd like to ask you one question off air that I'll put on the podcast. Stand by if you can. I'll understand if you can't. Don't go anywhere, America. I'm coming right back. We got a lot ahead today, including more of the Haviv Reddy Gore interview, all of which will be posted over at my YouTube channel. I am back with Noah Rothman. Noah, I just wanted to ask you a question because I listen to you a lot when you're on the National Review, the Editor's Podcast, or you're on as a guest on the Commentary Podcast, which you actually birthed. People should know that. That was your idea. I've heard you refer a few times to the China model. And I just have I have behind me Tom Cotton's new book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. The China model is actually the Leninist model. Xi Jinping is a Leninist. He's a hardcore Leninist. Why do you use China model as opposed to Leninist?
Well, because it didn't used to mean that. Before Xi took on this new role with this undisputed power, his power as a Chinese leader until death, he began re-Sovietizing the Chinese economy rapidly in an effort to restore Chinese Communist Party control over the private enterprises that had begun assuming more power than the government was comfortable with. Previously, the Chinese model, before Xi, the Chinese model meant rapid economic growth with limited personal individual liberty and freedoms and property rights in order to manage a political culture, but also have rapid 7% GDP growth year over year. It doesn't mean that anymore because of the Sovietization of the economy, because Xi's approach to COVID-0, for example, was such a disastrous failure. The Chinese model means something different. now, which is an exploitable opportunity for the West and for champions of liberty and democracy, to say nothing of capitalist enterprise. Because of the Chinese model's connotations have changed. For the developing world, it used to mean something very different than it does now. And I haven't read Tom Cotton's book, but hopefully he says, we should take maximum advantage of this changing paradigmatic approach to what the Chinese model meant.
He does, but he calls a communist. And that's what they're Chi-Coms. And that's the old 1950s term. And then let's make Chi-Coms great again. I don't want to, I fell for the whole China model thing, but it's not, that's over. Deng Xiaoping massacred 10,000 people, Tiananmen Square. It should have opened my eyes then. But Xi, genocide against the Uyghurs, he's just a communist.
Yeah, not just a communist, but as you say, a Leninist.
Yes.
And also a Stalinist in a particular way. Stalinization was a Russification program as well, as much as it was, the Lenin model was sort of an indigenous approach to indigenization in the Russian republics, the Soviet republics. The Stalin model Russified, borrowed that Tsarist product, Tsarist idea, and Russified these places, and created what is functionally an affirmative action empire, which is also a very good book. The Han Chinese dynasty that governs the communist China is a racist enterprise.
Yes.
It is a Han supremacist enterprise. It does not believe that there is such a thing as Uyghur culture. It is an aberration that needs to be stamped out. That is as Stalinist as it is Leninist, and I would venture more Stalinist.
It is an evil empire. That's the first chapter in Tom's book. I recommend it to you. Noah, thank you for the extra dollop of time. I am always listening to the editors at National Review, and when you get...
Got a spicy one for you today, Hugh. Spicy. Big debate on trade.
I will go and listen to it. You bet. Count on it, Noah. Thank you.
Take care.